Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and with the drop of patch 4.04, it seems that the entire Valorant world's been torn into one of two camps. You either love the fact that Astra and Viper have been neutered, or you think it has absolutely destroyed one of the most critical elements of the game. I'm not extremely far into either one of those camps, although I do think that it leans more to one than the other, and in this video we're going to take a look at why. Let's jump right into it. To stage set a little bit and make sure we're all on the same page for this conversation, you'll have to understand the analogy that I use to describe the macro strategy of this game, style dynamics. The easiest way to get up to speed on this will be to go watch my mastering macro video on style dynamics, linked in the top right corner, but a quick synopsis is that it's more or less directly stolen from TCGs like Magic the Gathering, as well as a couple other competitive outlets that use a similar balance style. This system of triangular dynamics where the first corner beats the second beats the third, but the third beats the first, is a great way to ensure that your competitive game is in a fairly consistent state of balance. I've applied this to Valorant both on the agent level and the compositional level, and when you actually look at the way that these style interactions should be functioning, they're evidenced on a broad statistical basis. We're talking the entire first year of professional Valorant. It was supported across nearly 200,000 rounds. It was further corroborated by champions at the end of last year, and it continues to hold strong in almost every example I've ever applied it to. The key things to keep in mind here in terms of terminology are simply the term itself, style dynamics, and what each of the three corners are. You have aggro, which is going to be a fast-paced, tempo-focused composition usually, control, which is going to be permission-focused and largely emphasize stalling, and mid-range, which is going to be flexibility-focused and put a lot of emphasis towards volume of utility and the ability to both take and yield space recurringly throughout a round. Now that we have a foundation of style dynamics set, in order to contextualize patch 4.04 itself, we need to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane and look at other patches that we've seen. If we go all the way back to patch 3.00, it was Riot's first pass at majorly nerfing Astra, as well as many agents in the roster, with really the initiators being the only ones who escaped completely unharmed. This is where we saw those buff nerf jumbles on both Breach and Sky, where they were losing flash count but getting supplemental power elsewhere in their kit, a real toss-up patch in general for the game. Going to the next patch of 3.05, it wasn't the biggest or most impactful. The main things that came through were damage nerfs to Raze's nade, as well as the slow on hit being reduced for Killjoy's turret. Patch 3.06 is where we saw the fairly significant nerfs to Sky, as well as the buffs that brought KO into playability. And now here in patch 4.04, we see major controller rebalancing across the board. If you distill each of these patches down to a net effect on each individual style, you get something a little bit like this. 3.00 being a light hit to aggro, a fairly heavy hit to control, and a net null for mid-range. Patch 3.05 being a small hit to both aggro and control and a buff to mid-range. And patch 3.06 being a slight buff to aggro, a net null for mid-range, and a slight buff to control. Now before we look at patch 4.04 in this context, let's stop at this point and look at what the net transition for each of these archetypes was over the first three patches that we've modeled here. Aggro was brought down twice and brought up once, so it's a little bit on the downtrend. Mid-range was net null twice and buffed once, so it should be overall doing quite well. And control was hit most out of any of these, heavily in the first, lightly in the second, and recovering some of that in the third. So aggro should be doing fairly poorly, control should be doing quite measurably poorly, and mid-range should be doing well as of the end of patch 3.06. Coincidentally, patch 3.06 was around the playtime of Champions 2021, and I've already run the performance of these styles at that event. Using my own compositional scoring system that I've used for quite a long time now, the winning median comp at Champions had a bit of a control skew, with both aggro and midrange coming in slightly behind. Now this should be immediately counterintuitive to what we were just looking at. We said that control should be in the worst situation, followed by aggro, and then midrange superseding both of the others. Complicating that further, normal triangular dynamics still held up. Aggro beating control, control beating mid-range, mid-range beating aggro, all of them showed up in the expected format, statistically evidenced. In fact, the only one that had somewhat weaker evidence than the others was mid-range beating aggro, while mid-range was the style that we expected to be performing the best coming into this event, based off of how Riot had been balancing up to this point. At this point, you're probably asking, alright, what the hell's the point? Start talking about patch 4.04. And that's precisely what we're going to do, but in a more abstract way. Instead of attacking the changes that were made in 4.04, I've now set the stage of the mindset that should have been had in this balance patch leading up to it, and I'm going to explain what should have been done given all of the reasoning that was available. So as we're going into patch 4.04, control is slightly surpassing the other archetypes, despite the fact that it's been hit fairly significantly over the last couple of patches. This is largely driven by the comparative superiority of controllers like Astra and Viper versus alternatives, although the power equilibrium is already close enough that there are exceptions. You see instances of Brimstone finding success at champions, instances of Omen finding success at champions. This is not unilateral. Mid-range, despite underperforming expectation, is still highly competitive, anchored by the overall efficiency of initiator utility. Aggro is performing at a similar level to mid-range, but artificially so. Aggro isn't actually performing at that level, it's the dive options within aggro that are performing at that level. Raze and then your omnipresence of Jet are pushing it to a level that it doesn't actually achieve in reality. As a tack on to that, despite the fact that aggro is being buoyed by those two agents, they in and of themselves are still enough to prove that there are opportunities for aggro to consistently outperform control when played at the highest levels. If we take each of those headlines and transmute them into something more actionable, you get the following. Control-leaning controllers need mild nerfs, aggro-leaning controllers need minor to intermediate scale buffs, non-dive aggro agents need significant retooling, and all of the above should be done in a way that barely touches, if not completely leaves alone, mid-range's balanced state. And so what does that look like in practicality? We need to nerf these more stally controllers. We can identify the part of each of these agents' kits that are critical for them being played in their primary style silo, as well as the elements that are more prominently used by their secondary style and when they're in supplements to other compositions. For instance, when we look at Astra, I've listed out all of the balance levers that we have access to. Her star count, her dissipate cooldown, her gravity well, her nova pulse, and her nebula. You can definitely get more granular with these, but for the sake of not making a many week-long video, we're going to keep it to this sort of higher level. Astra as an agent is a primary type control, secondary type mid-range. She's built in a way where she can fundamentally stall and entrench on a global basis, making her controlling aspects very front of mind, but she can also be used in a mid-range capacity if a team is looking to play out a more dynamic mid-round, because her volume of utility allows her to both take and retake space multiple times, abusing things like the fairly short Nova Pulse cooldowns, as well as her ability to withdraw stars regularly. Itemizing this out, we can look at her star count, which is key for control. She needs to be able to pre-place in a way that allows her to play her stally entrenchment style, but this is largely going to be luxury for mid-range. They don't care so much about star count so much as the ready availability of them. Dissipate cooldowns are also key for control, but much more of a luxury for mid-range. In control's case, you need to be able to place these stars for conditioning reasons in the early round, and then withdraw them and still have access to them for the mid to late round, whereas mid-range is often going to be using these in a more dynamic way where they're going to be placing them only when needed, so the dissipate is less critical. Then you have the gravity well, which is key for control and nice for mid-range, but far less necessary. It's predominantly a stall tactic here and is not going to be as much of a space-taking tool when it comes to those mid-range compositions. Nova Pulses are the interesting element because it's meaningful for both the control and mid-range ends, but it's actually more valuable for mid-range in my opinion. The pop nature of this makes it more of an initiation tool than anything else in Astra's kit, making it sort of adjacent to the rest of her playstyle. And then you have the smokes, which are fairly cut and dry. Obviously, they're going to be critical for everything. Now, if we keep in mind the premises we laid out at the start of this, we're trying to hit control in a way that doesn't touch mid-range. Control is overpowered, mid-range is struggling to even keep parity in the matchup it's supposed to naturally beat. So, in the way that we attack this, we want to hit control, but not also affect the areas that Astra is leveraging when she's included in mid-range compositions. This leads us to a hierarchy of Gravity Well being the best place to nerf her, Dissipate cooldowns being the second best place to nerf her, and Star Count being the third best. This is all going to be very subjective, but in my eyes, based off of all of this understanding, these are the changes that I would then make. I would be bumping Gravwell CD to somewhere between 30 and 35 seconds. I would be taking Dissipate cooldowns and increasing the return time to around 25 seconds, with a potential ratchet up to 35 seconds if it wasn't impactful enough. And I wouldn't touch the Star Count until it was an absolute last resort. If you're going to create a control agent like Astra, a huge part of her efficacy is going to be drawn by her ability to condition opponents with her utility. Star Count is the fundamental core of that. You can hit the cooldowns that those stars will ultimately represent, and that's perfectly fine. It's the threat that the base stars represent. I could be activating them. That is a core part of being a control agent. It's the near artificial threat that is imposed whenever a star is placed down in a specific area. So before I go too far down the rabbit hole, these are ultimately the changes I would have made to Astra. They aren't so significant that they would have made her unplayable and disable her from playing her stylistic niche, nor does her secondary style get caught in the crossfire, but they do dial her back enough that I believe, in tandem with buffs to her alternatives, would have created a balanced parity where we would have seen more variety. If we go over to Viper, it's a very similar process. Viper is primary type control, secondary type aggro, her fuel uptime being critical for both of those, her toxin decay being key for control but a luxury for aggro, her poison cloud being key for control but less so for aggro, her toxin screen being critical for both, and her snake bites being core for control but less so for aggro. Some people may look at this stylistic coding and say, what the hell are you on about? But if you look at Viper's design, it starts making a lot more sense. Control is obvious. She clearly fits that niche, but the aggro side comes from something a little bit more abstract and something that didn't really come into the limelight until Breeze was put into rotation, which is Viper enables some of the best contact plays of any agent in the game. You can obviously walk up in the space that's isolated by your Viper wall and then pop flash directly through it. That is where Viper's aggressive sub-elements come from, that and her ability to facilitate execs so efficiently, cutting off retake angles, being able to use snake bites to soft clear angles on execute. That's where the secondary typing stems. Again, going back to our premises, we're trying to hit control, buff aggro, and leave mid-range as it was. So we need to somehow find a way to hit Viper, hitting her primary type, while buffing her secondary type and or leaving it intact. That means our best opportunity is going to be the decay on her toxin, the second best is going to be her snake bites, and the third best is going to be her poison cloud. My swing at these would be to first reduce instant decay to only minus 10 HP. This is still non-trivial in that it will enable single-shot headshots with Phantom at any range, but it dials back something that is a near exclusively controlling element in Viper's kit. I would look at snake bites and turn them into something that's more of an execute facilitation rather than a stall mechanic. Chop the duration all the way down to 4 seconds, but increase the damage proportionally. So if I throw one of these on execute, you're still absolutely flushed out of your corner, but if then I use this to deny a bottleneck when you're executing and I'm on defense, the amount of time that I can stall you is now vastly reduced. I'm hitting the control element, I'm leaving the aggro portion alone, if not making it better. Then we have the Poison Cloud, which I think is tricky because it's so core to her kit, being her primary smoke, that you'd have to leave it alone for now. So now with the two control smokers brought into line, what do you do with the aggro ones to also give them an opportunity? First, we have Brimstone, who, I'll be honest, I think Riot actually hit the nail on the head with this one. I've been on podcasts and co-streams in the past where I have literally said, verbatim, that Stimpak should have a 15 to 25% move speed steroid on it. His identity as a aggro subtype mid-range controller that's looking to be explosive, this fits his stylistic niche, it's thematically in line, everything checks the boxes that they need to. The one scary subnote on this though is that when I made that 15 to 25% move speed suggestion, that was still functioning under the assumption that those compositions would have to contend with controlling utility in the form of full power Viper and Astra. With this now grossly accelerated rotation option, I think that we're going to see Brimstone become an absolutely premier aggressive controller. And last we have Omen, who I think Riot again did a fairly strong job with. In one of my other recent YouTube videos spurred by the release of Neon, I talked about mobility creep in VALORANT as well as the design identities of a lot of agents in the game, and how Omen, quite frankly, doesn't have a niche right now. He's part duelist, part initiator, part controller. He really doesn't know which direction he's going. In that same video, I made balance suggestions to Omen that basically committed him into being a controller who was subtyped into a duelist, and you grossly boosted the true mobility capabilities of Shrouded Step, and I loved the fact that that is one of the things that Riot hit on this patch by decreasing the time it took to teleport. It's still not so aggressive as to be what I suggested, which was to make it a near true untradeability mechanic, but the point stands that I think this was a healthy direction for Omen overall. Now that we've sort of gone over the pretext of this patch, as well as how I would have personally addressed it, it frames a lot better how I look at the changes that Riot made and why I think about them the way that I do. Based off of what I suggested, I'm sure you can already guess that I think this was an egregious overstep. I think that we haven't just nerfed control with these changes, we've effectively lopped it off of the style triangle in its entirety. An entire balancing corner of this game has been removed from play. You still have elements that can, in theory, provide that sort of controlling archetype. You've got Chamber, you've got Sage, you've got Killjoy, you've got Cypher, but Killjoy and Cypher are fairly easily played around. Similar Chamber, you could pre-shock his utility, although the range on it makes it a little bit more finicky and teams would have to be a lot more dynamic to answer it, but you don't really have a controller that fits this niche anymore. Astra's been nerfed to the point where she's as much a mid-range controller as she is a control one. Viper's been nerfed so hard that she functions more as an aggro controller than as a control one, and a bad aggro one at that. So what exactly are you left with? You've literally removed this playstyle from viability, and you're going to end up with a meta that is a lot of 4-1 defaults, a lot of full 5-man hits, and a near inability to consistently defend sites. You're going to have teams playing for full retake constantly because rather than trying to defend a site and constantly fail due to the way that the game's been balanced, they're going to opt to quote-unquote play aggression on defense, fall back, and then re-execute onto the team in the post plan. It's a real mess, and I'm honestly not sure what the Valorant devs were thinking when they went through these changes. I think that either side of the patch, the buffs to the aggro controllers or the nerfs to the control controllers would have been perfectly fine. Them in tandem is the major issue here. And it's going to push the game into what many people will like. It's going to be faster, it's going to be flashier, but in terms of competitive health and from the perspective of a coach who has to be able to make a team convert wins on a consistent basis, it's a hellscape. Planning around this is going to be absolutely miserable because it's an extremely linear playstyle that relies almost exclusively on firepower. Your ability to out-macro your opponents, your ability to outthink and outplan your opponents has been reduced significantly. And that's just a really unfortunate direction for the game, in my opinion. If you want a further highlight of this sort of movement away from deeper, more strategic play, look at the change that was made to Viper. We've now put a literal indicator light on her smokes when they're on cooldown. You don't have to be an intelligent player who tracks fuel cycles. You don't have to be someone who's proactively looking at what your opponents are doing and playing around their cooldowns. The game just screams it at you. They're quite literally making the game dumber for arbitrary reasons. It's unfortunate. I'm personally not a huge fan of it, but I can understand, based off of the community sentiment that I've seen, why they're doing it, at least in some capacity. I hope that there's grander reasoning than just sort of kowtowing to the general public, but for now, that's really the only rationale I can see. That's all I've got on patch 4.04, or at least all I'm going to put in this video to spare you the rest of your day. Hopefully you got something out of it, a coach's perspective on macro strategy, style dynamics, and how they're affected patch by patch, how I contextualize them, and how I personally hope the game is balanced, and sort of the methods that I would personally use if I was approaching it myself. If you enjoyed it, would love to hear comments down below on your thoughts on this patch. In the Twitter sphere, I've seen both ends of the spectrum to the extreme. People who absolutely love it, people who absolutely hate it, and every single spot in between. Would love to see down below your personal stance on it. And if you did enjoy it as well, don't forget to like and subscribe. I push this sort of content out whenever possible, but being an active coach, it is easier said than done. There are, however, channel memberships that you can also use where you'll get my take on a ranked agent tier list that's updated every single patch, including this shit show of a one. And you get shoutouts on this channel. My current channel members are Colin Torbis, Hick Messiah, Phantos Rock, and Nahid Rumi. Huge shout out to them for giving me that extra little push of motivation to push out these videos as often as humanly possible. And per the usual, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.